What if the lights went out today? What if winter knocked at your door with winds at negative 30 degrees Celsius, the same as negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit? Would you have anything left to eat by the third night? In the year 1315, the skies closed in. Famine swept across entire kingdoms. Children were buried without names. Families boiled the leather of their own boots to trick their stomachs into believing they were fed. There was no refrigeration, no gas, only snow, silence, and despair. At 10 o'clock at night, in a small village deep in medieval Europe, a woman sobbed over an empty pot. She knew that unless she remembered what the ancients once knew, her daughter would not see the light of the next morning. This isn't a story about war. It's a story about what kept a people alive when everything else around them died. Forgotten wisdom. Faith in the unseen. The ancient art of turning the impossible into nourishment. Today you will uncover the 7 medieval survival techniques that separated those who lived from those who merely tried. But the real question is, if the world stopped tomorrow, would you know how to keep your family alive through the end of winter? It's 5 degrees Celsius, equivalent to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cuts through the cracks in the walls as if the wood itself never existed. Outside, the silence isn't peace, it's abandonment. It's the sound of snow swallowing rooftops, doors, and bodies. Inside the village, the steps of the medieval peasants grow slower with each passing hour. There is nowhere left to go, nothing left to seek. The market had shut down at the start of the brutal winter. Now even the dogs have stopped barking. In one of the huts, made of clay, straw, and desperate faith, a man slowly stirs a pot over weak embers. There's no meat, only water, dried garlic, and a withered shred of cabbage. He watches the boiling broth as if it were the last few minutes of hope itself. On the wall behind him, his wife tries to warm the children's hands with her own breath. The smoke from wet firewood rises sluggishly, as if even the fire had given up the fight. The eyes of those who live here no longer shine, not from sadness, but from habit. Hunger during the Middle Ages wasn't an event, it was a routine. Frozen villages knew that without ancestral techniques, without forgotten wisdom, the body wouldn't last long. And even so, there was silence. Not the silence of the dead, but the silence of those still clinging to life, and barely. On the stone rooftop next door, someone tries to dry herbs in the frost. In the barn, rats have been seen, carrying away seeds hidden by the peasants. Even the animals were fighting for survival. No one here counted on miracles. They counted on resistance, without technology, on the memory of what the ancients had once learned in the midst of despair, and maybe on luck. But what about you? If you had to endure a brutal winter like this, would you know what to do before it's too late? They had no refrigerators, no glass jars, no stainless steel, no vacuum packaging, and yet many medieval peasants survived the longest winters with food still on the table, or rather, on the hard-packed dirt floor, surrounded by the smoke of the fire and the bitter scent of cold. In the battle against hunger during the Middle Ages, salt was more precious than gold. In frozen villages, a pinch of salt meant more than faith, it meant survival. It wasn't just seasoning, it was a silent guardian. And like all guardians, it had to be used with reverence. Salt wasn't scattered. It was pressed, dried, bonded to the meat like a second skin. It kept death from entering through the veins of their food. Imagine a small wooden hut, its windows covered with old cloth. Inside, a father rubs coarse salt into a fish while his son spins a bucket of frozen well water. The meat is then wrapped in linen cloth soaked with vinegar, bundled like a newborn, and buried inside a clay pot, surrounded by oak leaves and ashes from the fire. The pot, sealed with wax and heavy cloth, is placed in a shallow pit next to the house where the earth remains cold, but alive. There, in that womb of clay and tradition, the fish would wait for its moment to be reborn as sustenance. The technique may seem simple, almost primitive, but it saved hundreds of villages. It was used in monasteries, on battlefields, in the homes of the poor, and in the kitchens of kings. Those who mastered the art of salt had mastered time itself, because in a brutal winter, time was no ally. It was the enemy. And against time, medieval peasants learned to wield the eternal mineral as a weapon. There were legends of salted meat found months later still intact. Some said if done right, this technique could preserve food for more than 6 moons. Some believed the salt was blessed. Others simply trusted the elders, the whispered words by candlelight, the forgotten wisdom that wasn't written in scrolls, but carved into their bones by pain. In the peak of winter, when even their bones seemed to crack from the cold, The sound of a buried pot being unearthed was like music. And when the cloth was lifted and the salty aroma filled the house, it was a feast, even without laughter, because survival itself was celebration. Today you may have never touched a clay pot. Maybe you've never salted anything with your bare hands, but think, if tomorrow the power grid failed, if the shelves emptied overnight, would you know how to protect your family's food with something as simple and sacred as salt? While the snow still fell and bodies craved warmth, something was bubbling quietly in the corner of the medieval kitchen, a subtle, almost secret sound. It was life, fermenting in silence, because medieval peasants didn't just store food, they cultivated resilience. They created nourishment that defied time, cold, and disease, food that healed, strengthened, and rekindled hope, even when the world outside seemed frozen solid. Inside stone, barrels buried beneath the cabin floors, cabbage was chopped by rough hands, submerged in salted water, and weighted down with heavy stones. Slowly, over the days, it would develop a strong smell, a vibrant color, and a flavor that modern palates might reject. But back then, it was received as a miracle. This was the ancient art of fermentation, and it did far more than feed. It healed fevers, fortified bodies, and gave just enough strength to split wood under -10 degrees Celsius, equivalent to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. During a brutal winter, while the frozen villages struggled to keep even a weak fire burning, this living soup was served raw alongside stale bread and dark vinegar. It was enough to keep a man standing, enough to keep a pregnant woman breathing, enough to keep a child smiling even when there was little reason left. And the most impressive part, they achieved all of this without a single manual. No thermometers, no measuring cups, no refrigeration, only forgotten wisdom, passed from mouth to ear, from tear to tear across generations. Today it might seem strange to us, letting something spoil on purpose, but back then they knew that within carefully controlled decay, new life was waiting to save them. And it worked. It saved countless lives. And if this reflection stirs something inside you, if you feel like you're relearning a wisdom that once belonged to your ancestors, subscribe to this channel. Here, we're not just rescuing ancient techniques, we're rebuilding the bridge between the past and the now. And if winter ever returns, as it once did for them, you'll know where to find the knowledge the world tried to forget. So let me ask you, would you have the courage to open a barrel of fermented cabbage? If it meant keeping your family alive for one more week. Today, if the power goes out for just 3 hours, many fall into panic. The fridge beeps, the delivery app crashes, the router's light blinks in warning, and suddenly modern security turns into a digital mirage. But imagine if the power never came back, not today, not tomorrow, not even through the next winter. What would be left of you, San, without your machines? In the days of medieval survival, a peasant knew exactly where his resources were. With bare feet rooted in the soil, with calloused hands on wood, and with the memory shining in a grandmother's eyes, they didn't need passwords, QR codes, or notifications to know if their food was ready. They trusted the smell, the color, the texture, and most of all tea time itself, because time for them was felt, not measured. In a frozen village of the 14th century, where even the idea of modern comfort did not exist, a simple buried clay pot meant resilience. They knew that when the ice sealed the roads and the rivers stopped flowing, there would be no trade, no barter, no help coming, only what they had planted, harvested, and preserved with faith and sweat. And yet, amidst the famine of the Middle Ages, many survived. Why? Because they had ancestral techniques, forgotten wisdom, practical faith, and a deep collective sense of responsibility. They shared a little of what they had and hid the rest like they were guarding treasure. Treasure that didn't glitter, but that sustained their bodies through the frozen dawn. A piece of salted meat, a dried root, a barrel of cabbage, fermenting quietly in the dark. Today we are surrounded by resources, yet most of us would be lost without a glowing screen to guide our hands. Modern battles against the cold involve thermostats, heaters, thermal jackets, but real resistance without technology was woven from straw, clay, and unshakable belief. A fire kindled from stone, a blanket sewn from rags, and most importantly, knowledge passed by voice, not by code. Medieval peasants had little, but they knew much. We have much and we have forgotten almost everything. And the question that echoes louder than the hum of a generator failing in the night is this: if the world shut down today, would you know how to keep your home warm and your food alive until the next full moon? Deep within the forest, where snow had yet to bury the earth completely, medieval peasants would descend silently before dawn to gather. Something unseen by the wrong eyes. It wasn't game, it wasn't firewood, it was a secret buried both in the soil and in stories that were never written down. They called it bread of the ground, a blend of twisted roots, fibrous mosses, and fermented bark, all torn from the frozen earth, with bare hands boiled in dark water, mixed with oak ashes and buried once again inside clay pots, sealed with animal fat. These pots were hidden in deep holes, sometimes even inside false graves, to fool soldiers, tax collectors, and even the church. This technique, although vital, was considered impure by many kingdoms. In times of famine during the Middle Ages, anyone caught preparing food with decomposition herbs could be accused of witchcraft or heresy. But in frozen villages, where even the crows had stopped flying, no one cared about dogma, only about seeing the next sunrise. The process had to be precise. The moss had to be washed 7 times, the roots boiled for 9 hours, the pot sealed with wax and buried under black stones to keep the temperature constant. And even then, the result was unpredictable. Some said the taste was like clay soaked in vinegar. Others swore that eating it sent a wave of warmth up their spine, as if the earth itself were repaying the effort to survive. Peasant nuns taught this art to their daughters in secret. Some even stitched parts of the process into cloth, hidden among their blankets. When soldiers came, women would pretend they were preparing tea, and sometimes they were. But the tea wasn't the point. The pot was. In the heart of a brutal winter, when food vanished like smoke, this bread of the ground saved lives, not only the body, but the mind as well, because those who chewed earth, seasoned with fear, learned quickly what true humility was, and what faith meant. Not faith from an altar, but faith born of mud, of raw medieval survival, of a forgotten wisdom that today might be called madness. And the most curious part? Modern researchers have tried to replicate this mixture in laboratories. The result? Nutritious, rich in fiber, highly resistant to contamination, but nearly impossible to swallow for anyone who has never known real hunger. So I ask you, would you accept this challenge? Would you boil roots and moss for 9 long hours, bury them in clay, and wait for 3 moons? If it meant the difference between feeding your children or hearing them cry through the 3rd frozen night, somewhere, deep in the night, a mother wraps her child tighter against the cold. Outside, the wind howls like a wounded beast. Inside, the pot buried beneath the earth holds a promise, not of comfort, but of survival. In the world of medieval survival, every heartbeat was a rebellion against the cold. Every scrap of food was a prayer whispered in frozen breath. And every night survived was a small miracle carved into the silence. If these medieval survival techniques have been surprising you so far, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we are not just rescuing stories, we are reviving skills that may one day save lives. Now imagine the fire almost dying out, cold hands trembling, and deep beneath the earth, the last hope smoldering slowly. This was the art of underground smoking. It wasn't enough to have meat. You had to protect it from the cold, from pests, from thieves, and from time itself. Medieval peasants learned to turn holes in the ground into true sanctuaries of food resilience. In small chambers dug out with wooden and stone tools, they built simple structures: clay walls, narrow entrances, low ceilings. Inside, glowing embers would burn slowly, releasing a steady flow of smoke, not to warm bodies but to embalm food. Whole cuts of meat were hung on crossed wooden beams. Thick fish, hunted birds, even tough root vegetables, all exposed to the bitter smoke rich in tannins that would seep deep into the fibers, sealing, curing, preserving. They had to keep the fire alive, fire almost invisibly. No flames, no noise, no bright light. A fire not meant for seeing, but for trusting. The frozen villages of the 14th century knew if the brutal winter lasted more than 3 moons, those without a smoking chamber would likely never see the spring. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes, their wood, their hair. For some, it was a source of shame. For others, it was a badge of ancestral pride. A peasant reeking of smoke was a peasant who would survive. Sometimes, during the long hours of the night, you could spot a faint wisp of smoke escaping discreetly from a frozen hillside. It was a silent signal. Life, though fragile, was still resisting. Beneath the earth, smoking wasn't just about preserving food. It was about preserving hope, and it's curious to think, today, with all our Technology, refrigerators, and vacuum seals, we've lost that direct connection to fire, to patience, to the almost sacred act of preparing the future with our own hands. They trusted fire as much as they trusted faith, and when snow covered the fields and the bread turned to stone, it was in the smoked meat, hanging like relics in cold chambers, that medieval peasants found the strength to endure one more day. So tell me, would you have the courage to keep a fire burning, day and night hidden beneath the earth, knowing that a single failure could cost your entire family's survival? There was once a winter, not like the winters we conquer today with electric fireplaces and microfiber blankets. No, this was a winter where the very earth seemed eager to devour the living. They say that in the 14th century, between villages forgotten by crowns and abandoned by gods, the icy cold fell like a silent curse. It snowed day after day. The snow did not melt, it simply piled higher and higher. The doors of houses, made of warped boards and thin hope, began to twist and splinter. The chimneys stopped breathing smoke, and the most common sound, after the howling wind tearing through bare trees, was the creaking of roofs collapsing under the crushing weight of the brutal winter. In the frozen villages, where the fight against the cold had long been woven into their blood, even the hardest of medieval peasants began to lose hope. The hay stored for the cattle rotted, the chickens froze on their perches, the precious salt hardened into unbreakable stones within their clay jars, and then all that remained was to dig through the snow, to claw with bare hands, digging desperately for a forgotten root, a hardened handful of moss, or sometimes nothing at all. In those times the village bell, once used to summon for mass or announce births, rang for another grimmer purpose. 3 dry tolls in the distance meant a house had been sealed by the snow. An entire family would not be coming out again. Records tell of nights when the wind was so fierce, the houses themselves seemed to breathe. The walls shifted, the floors froze beneath their feet, and inside, huddled together like frightened cubs, the medieval peasants prayed, or simply closed their eyes and waited. On the night when the snow sealed the door from the outside, only silence remained. And inside a small wooden house, cold and narrow as a tomb, a child still licked the salt from the cracks in the wall, an animal instinct, trying to suck the last traces of survival from the wood. There were no heroes in those days, no knights in shining armor riding to the rescue. There were only cracked hands, hollow stomachs, and the fading memory of ancestral techniques, the ones that separated those who lived to see the thaw from those who became part of the snow. Forgotten wisdom was no luxury, it was life or death. Knowing how to ferment, smoke, salt, hide, ration, these were the silent weapons against the brutal winter. And today, looking around at our heated homes, our packed cupboards, our endless delivery apps, the question returns, as cold and cutting as the blade of a medieval wind. If everything stopped tomorrow, if the world froze into silence, would you have anything more than hope to survive? Or would you end up licking salt from the walls and like a child forgotten by time, after the cold, after the hunger, after the most brutal fear? There was still something that even the snow could not bury: silent hope. Among medieval peasants, a secret, teaching passed quietly from mouth to ear. Always set aside a portion of what you had, say, for the unknown. They called it the bread of the stranger. Even amidst the brutal winter, even with stomachs growling in the dark, many peasants hid a small reserve of food, not for themselves, but for the one who might knock at the door one night, with hollow eyes and frozen breath. It wasn't a military strategy, it wasn't a storage technique, it was practical faith, forgotten wisdom that no one survives alone. It was easy to say no, it was easy to shut the doors and save the thin soup for your own children. But among those who endured the fiercest winters of the Middle Ages, there were always those who said yes. Yes to sharing. Yes to making space where there was none. Yes to believing that saving one might eventually save all, and more than once, this reserved bread saved not just the stranger, but also the one who had offered it, because sometimes that stranger was a traveler who carried news of hidden food deep in the forest, or a lost hunter who knew where better shelter could be found, or simply a desperate soul who, once warmed, returned human warmth to those who were already giving up. The battle against the cold wasn't only fought outside, it raged within the walls of the chest. Those who locked themselves away completely froze from the inside out. Those who dared to open their doors kept the fire burning, the blood flowing, the hope alive. Many stories tell of entire families saved because on the coldest night, when the firewood was gone and the soup turned to ice, Someone they had once helped returned, carrying a sack of hidden grain beneath their cloak. True resistance without technology was never made only of clay, salt, and fire. It was forged through invisible acts, through silent pacts among the living. Setting aside a part of the food for others was, deep down, setting aside a piece of one's own humanity. Today, surrounded by solid walls, full markets, and locked doors, maybe we have forgotten that true survival was never meant to be a solitary victory. And if tomorrow the world froze once again, if the famine of the Middle Ages returned to haunt our modern homes, would you have the courage to share your last piece of bread? Or would you lock your door hoping the winter would take everyone else first? Winter doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wonder if you're ready. It arrives like an old debt collector, cold, silent, and relentless. Imagine this. You wake at 22 hours into the night, the wind hammering against the windows. The fireplace dies without a sound. The power vanishes. Your cell phone becomes nothing but dead weight in your hands. Water starts to freeze inside the mugs. The grain stored in the pantry suddenly looks pitifully small. And the night stretches endlessly. What would you do? Medieval peasants never had to ask that question. They already knew each night could be their last. That the brutal winter offered no second chances. Every gesture, every preparation, every piece of smoked meat and fermented root was an unspoken prayer. Today, wrapped in comfort, we trust too much. We trust there will be light at the press of a button, food behind every door, warmth at the turn of a dial. But what if there isn't? If the storm lasted 3 days or 30? If the roads closed, the markets emptied, the systems collapsed? If you could no longer call for help? If waiting was no longer an option? If the only thing standing between your family and oblivion was what you knew or what you didn't? The battle against cold, against hunger, against despair wasn't the stuff of legends in the Middle Ages. It was daily life. It was survival. And what separated the living from the dead was not luck, it was preparation, practical wisdom, courage without an audience. Today we fantasize about what we would do in an apocalypse. They in the 18th century lived their own apocalypse every brutal winter. And you, could you build warmth with your bare hands, keep food alive without a refrigerator, offer bread to a stranger not knowing if there would be enough for tomorrow? Or would you sit before a cold, empty hearth and clutching memories, waiting for the end? And if tonight were the last night with light, would you have the means to warm yourself, or only the memories to hold on to? What kept medieval peasants alive wasn't just salt, nor clay, nor fire. It was something unseen, something untouchable, yet passed through time like a torch from hand to hand. It was knowledge. It was the living memory that survival is an act of construction, that even in the midst of a brutal winter, even facing the famine of the Middle Ages, there was something no cruel snowstorm could ever erase. They carried ancestral techniques like invisible amulets. They knew how to ferment, to smoke, to hide roots, to preserve life between stones and smoke. But above all, they understood that true survival was never in things. It lived in memory, in gestures passed from generation to generation, in the silent decision to prepare today what might save tomorrow. The frozen villages disappeared. The kings changed. The wars ended. But what remains, echoing through the cracks of time, is the knowledge of those who refused to perish in silence. Today, surrounded by full shelves and heated homes, it seems easy to forget. But one day, perhaps sooner than we imagine, the earth may tremble again. The cold may return, and what will stand between us and the void will be what we preserve now. Food perishes, the body withers, the fire dies out. But knowledge crosses centuries. And you, when the next winter comes, not the one on the calendar, but the winter that comes, to test your soul, will you be ready to remember? Or will you wish you had learned in time? If this journey through the frozen winds of history has sparked something in your heart, join our brotherhood of guardians of ancestral wisdom. Subscribe now and carry with you not just stories, but the living flame of resistance. Leave a comment below. Which ancestral technique would you rely on first to protect your family from the next brutal winter? Your like is not just a gesture, it's another torch we keep burning against the tide of forgetting. Share this knowledge, because saving ancient wisdom is saving future lives. And before the embers cool, step forward on your journey. The next video on your screen reveals secrets that could mean the difference between enduring and disappearing into the snows of time.